Data is simply changing the way that we shop, eat, vote, search, or even whom we marry. Today, all of us generate large volumes of data that is invaluable to companies, shops, restaurants, websites. Phew, the list is endless. Analytics is the language of data. It allows us to talk to data and, more importantly, listen to what the data has to tell us. This becomes especially critical in today's workplace, where we are surrounded by data. By learning to listen to it, we can uncover hidden trends and insights that ultimately allow us to make better business decisions. What makes analytics truly amazing is that any system that generates data is a potential information goldmine. This could be a small household, a multi-million-dollar company, the snack food stall down the road, or even your own Facebook account. So how does analytics work? Like all good stories, it must start with a conflict or problem. Next, to solve the conflict, we must collect the relevant data and organize it. Then comes the fun part. The collected information can now be played around with, scrunched, squeezed, or even flipped over backwards to, voila, uncover patterns that would not have been obvious before. Patterns reveal trends, choices, behavior. We're sure you get the picture. So are you interested in learning the language of data? That's where Jigsaw Academy, the online school of analytics, can help you. With courses designed by industry experts from across the globe, Jigsaw will help you develop the relevant analytic skills to boost your profile and empower you to make decisions based on data, whichever field or industry you may be in. We hope you enjoy learning with Jigsaw Academy. Thank you, and best of luck.
We are going to cover a case study on fraud modeling in this session. The agenda of the session is going to mirror the standard modeling methodology. We'll start by defining the problem. We will then explore the data that is there with us. We will prepare the data for modeling. We will create a logistic regression model, and then we will validate the data. In this session, we will not spend too much time on model implementation and tracking. That's out of scope for this particular case study. So let's start with the first step of the modeling methodology, that of problem definition. In order to understand the problem definition for this particular case study, we need to understand how credit card processing works. So it typically starts with a seller having something that the buyer wants to buy. The buyer wants to use the credit card to make the payment. Now you have to understand a credit card is not really a payment. A credit card is more a promise to pay. The seller is not actually receiving the money in his hands when he's doing a credit card transaction. So the first thing the seller needs to do is to verify if the account actually exists, and if it does, is there enough credit to cover the transaction. The shopper hands over her credit card to the seller. The seller then swipes the credit card in the credit card machine. When the seller swipes the credit card, one of the things that happens is that an inquiry is raised with the issuing bank. The issuing bank is the bank that has issued the shopper's credit card. So when the seller swipes the card, he is basically sending an inquiry to the issuing bank asking if this account actually exists and if there is enough credit to cover the transaction. If the answer to both these questions is yes, then the seller receives the authorization from the issuing bank. Once the seller has received the authorization from the issuing bank, he goes ahead with the transaction. The seller now understands that he can make a claim on the buyer's line of credit and he can go ahead with the transaction. The seller still does not have the money. Now the process of the seller receiving the money for this transaction is not a straightforward process. The first step in that process is that the issuing bank will make a payment to the acquiring bank. This happens typically at the end of each day, when all banks come together and settle their claims against each other. In this case, the issuing bank will look at the acquiring bank's claim and will transfer the money to the acquiring bank. The acquiring bank will then release this money into the seller's account. Now the seller has received his money. Meanwhile, the issuing bank will post the charge on the buyer's credit card. The buyer will then make his payment and settle the whole transaction. So this is how a typical transaction happens. Now what happens in the case of a fraudulent transaction? In the case of a fraudulent transaction, it is someone other than the card holder who's gone ahead and made the transaction. So now when the shopper sees the transaction in his credit card bill, she will raise a complaint with the issuing bank. So she will go back to the issuing bank and say, look, this transaction that you've posted on my statement is not something that I've made and I don't want to pay for this. The issuing bank is now going to go back to the acquiring bank, which is the seller's bank, and say that the transaction for which I paid you was a fraudulent transaction, so I need to take the money back from you. The acquiring bank will now go back to the merchant and say that the transaction that I paid you for was a fraudulent transaction and I need the money back from you. So if you notice, it's the merchant who ultimately ends up bearing the brunt of the fraud. The merchant has to pay the money back to the acquiring bank, and the acquiring bank will pay the money back to the issuing bank, which will then credit it back into the customer's account. So that's how fraud liability works. Now the merchant bears the risk in most of the cases, but the acquiring bank also bears a large amount of risk, and that largely comes from the credit worthiness of the merchant. So there are two cases in which the merchant will not pay the acquiring bank. First case is when the merchant itself is indulging in these fraudulent activities, in which case the merchant has basically deceived the acquiring bank and has made the fraudulent transactions, and it's not going to pay the acquiring bank back. The second case is when the merchant does not have the ability to pay. The merchant has declared bankruptcy and does not have the ability to pay the acquiring bank. In this case, again the acquiring bank bears the risk. So it's largely the merchants and the acquiring bank, or the merchant's bank, which bear the risk of fraudulent transactions. So this is where our case study comes in. Our client is the acquiring bank or the merchant's bank. The business problem is to strengthen the fraud detection strategy, use historical data on merchant performance to identify merchants that are likely to indulge in fraudulent activities. The acquiring bank is basically trying to build better predictive models in order to strengthen its fraud detection strategy. The analytics problem here is fairly simple. Use historic data to build a predictive model to predict fraudulent activities. The target variable here being GT2, which denotes whether a merchant in the historical data was fraud or not. The value is good for all good merchants and the value is 1 for fraud merchants. So we have a variable GT2 which takes the value of 0 for all good observations and 1 for fraud observations. The historical data that we have consists of 254,056 merchants. 253,048 of them are good merchants and 1,008 are bad observations or bad merchants. So we have data on a large number of merchants and we have data on 1,008 fraudulent transactions or fraudulent merchants. We have about 30 to 40 variables which we can use to build the model to predict fraud, and the target variable is GT2. Let us first look at the variables that are present in this data set. So we run a simple proc contents on the dataset in order to understand the kind of variables that are present. So there are 31 variables in all. Here we see some of the variables. One thing you'll notice is that all of these variables are numeric. You can look at the column type to see whether a variable is numeric or character. This is the second set of variables. You can again see most of these are numeric. There is one character variable, exclude underscore ind, which is some kind of an indicator, which is a character variable. The rest are all numeric variables. So these are all the variables that are present in the data set. Now in order to understand what these variables mean, we have to go to the data dictionary. A data dictionary is a simple document that usually comes with all data sets. The data dictionary contains the definition of each variable. The data dictionary contains the definition of each variable and the corresponding calculation. So here, for example, we see the first variable DLY underscore 80, which stands for daily average ticket. The definition is the average amount per sales transaction for the work of date. So this is the average amount per sales transaction that happens for each merchant. The calculation for this is the daily gross sales amount divided by the number of transactions that happen every day. So it's the average sales amount for each transaction. This variable can be useful for us because a fraudulent transaction in general may have a higher amount of transaction value than the average sales transaction. The second variable that we see here is DLY underscore C card underscore AMT PCT, which stands for daily corporate card sales amount ratio. This is the total amount of daily corporate card sales compared with the total amount of gross sales. So this variable is basically telling us what percentage of the total sales come from corporate cards. In case fraud is associated with a corporate card, we may be able to identify it using this variable. So this variable is telling us what percentage of the total sales come from corporate cards. The next variable, daily corporate card transaction count, is essentially giving us similar information, the number of sales transactions on corporate cards on a daily basis. So this is just a simple count. The next variable that we have is the daily chargeback average ticket. This is the average amount per chargeback. A chargeback is a return transaction resulting from lack of adherence to certain conditions and results in the debiting of the merchant's account. A chargeback is a return transaction. So this is where the money has to go back to the customer, so it has to be debited from the merchant's account. So the daily chargeback average ticket could also be an indicator for fraud. So these are the definitions of the first four variables as per the data dictionary, as well as the calculations for these variables. Similarly, we have to look at each and every variable. We have 31 variables in this. We have to look at all 31 variables, understand their definition as well as how they are calculated in order to get a sense of the information that we are dealing with. In the financial services world, there are often a lot of transformations that we can do with the variables that are there. There are numerous transformations that we can do with a single variable. For example, on this slide, we see the variable chargeback. A chargeback is a return transaction, and that happens when certain conditions have been violated, and this results in the debiting of the merchant's account. So a chargeback is a transaction which has been returned, and now the money has to be given back to the customer. So the money has to be debited by the merchant's bank or the acquiring bank from the merchant's account. So for this variable, we can see a number of transformations here. The first one is daily chargeback amount, which is just the sum of daily chargeback amounts. The second variable is the average amount per chargeback. So we take the sum of daily chargeback amounts and divide it by the number of transactions, that number of chargeback transactions, to get the average amount per chargeback. The third variable is the count of the transactions, the number of chargebacks that happened on a day. The fourth variable, which is daily chargeback ratio, is the percentage of daily chargeback amount compared with the daily gross sales amount. So what percentage of the daily gross sales result in chargeback? The idea is that if there is a higher percentage here for certain merchants, that may be an indicator for fraud. Similarly, we can have data aggregated over different time periods. For example, 180-day chargeback ratio calculates the same thing as the daily chargeback ratio except over a 6-month period. 30-day chargeback amount does the same thing as the daily chargeback amount, except it does it for a 30-day period. Similarly, we have 7 days, we have 90 days, and we have 12 months as well. You can see all the different transformations for a single variable. In financial services and in many other domains, it often makes sense to have variables that summarize information over different time periods, similar to what we are seeing here. It is very important as an analyst to understand all of these variables and the information that is captured in these in order to make the best use of them. There are a lot of other interesting variables which can help us identify fraud. Analyzing round number transactions can prove useful for reviewing retail business transactions. Fraud transactions often have round number values, example $250 or $120. Just think about it. If anyone is going to make a fraudulent transaction, they are usually thinking in terms of round numbers. 5,000 rupees, 10,000 rupees, $200, $1,000. So a lot of fraud transactions tend to have round number values. So it's always a good idea to review the number of round number transactions that you're seeing in a day. In real life, transactions seldom come to an even dollar amount because most businesses price their products just below the next whole dollar amount. So in the US, it's common practice to have items priced at $2.99 or $3.99, and then you add tax on top, and you will almost never end up with a round number transaction. Fraudulent transactions, on the other hand, often tend to be round number transactions. Most spreadsheets and database programs can process a formula to quickly highlight transactions with round dollar amounts, and you can always use this variable as an indicator for fraud. Even dollar amounts are amounts that end with 2 zeros before the decimal and have 2 zeros after the decimal. Example $2300.00. That's a even dollar amount. There are 2 zeros before the decimal and 2 zeros after it. Similar to round number transactions, even dollar amounts can also help us identify fraud. Consumer disputed chargebacks refer to transactions which have been disputed by the consumer. These transactions can sometimes be fraudulent transactions, therefore it's a good idea to have this kind of variable in your database. Declined authorization amount. These declines indicate a lack of cardholder credit limit availability at the time of authorization request, which means that these transactions were made when there wasn't sufficient line of credit on the credit card. That is often again a sign of fraudulent transactions. Fraudsters often don't know when they've reached the limit of the credit card, so they will often keep trying till they get a declined authorization. So declined authorization amounts can often be an indicator of fraudulent transactions. Foreign card amount refers to the sale from transactions conducted in a foreign country. Foreign card transactions are more likely to be fraudulent transactions, especially certain countries. This is because credit card companies have analyzed their data and they found that foreign card transactions, especially when they happen in certain specific countries, have a high likelihood of being fraudulent. So foreign card amount is often a good indicator for predicting fraud. Government card amount refers to purchases on government cards. This is additional information that is available in the database. Sometimes if fraud is associated specifically with government cards, this may be an indicator that can come in useful. Fraud chargeback amount relates to chargebacks that have reason codes related to fraud, which means that these are chargebacks which pertain to fraud, which means most likely these are fraudulent transactions. So this kind of an indicator is often very useful. Risk scores are generated to assess the risk profile of each merchant. These scores are often used for fraud detection as well. So risk scores are basically scores that are generated for each merchant and predict the likelihood of the merchant being low risk, medium risk or high risk. So these risk scores can often also be used for fraud detection. So this is an example of some interesting variables in the financial services sector that you will often see coming in significant, especially when it relates to fraud detection. Once we've understood all the variables, the next thing that we need to do is identify the character variables and convert them into numeric variables. We've already run the proc contents on this data, and we've identified one character variable, which is exclude_ind. Now let's investigate this variable further. So the first step is to check the frequency distribution of the various classes in this field. So let's run a simple procfrec on this data. We've run a procfrec on exclude_ind, and we can see that there are three categories in this: D, N and Y. And we can see the breakup of the dependent variable GT2 by these three classes. So we can see that there are three distinct classes, D, N and Y in exclude_ind. The next step for us is to convert this variable into continuous variable. Now if you remember, the way to convert a categorical variable into a continuous variable is to create dummy variables. So in this case we will create 3 new dummy variables. We'll create exclude underscore ind underscore d and exclude underscore ind underscore n and exclude underscore ind underscore y. We are creating 3 dummy variables to convert this one variable exclude underscore ind, which has 3 distinct classes. So for each class we are creating a dummy variable, and what we are saying is if exclude underscore ind is equal to d, then exclude underscore ind underscore d is equal to 1, else it's 0. So we are creating these 3 dummy variables that will take a value of 0 or 1 depending on the value of exclude underscore ind variable. Let's run this code now, and let's go to the log to see that this has come out okay. So we can see that the code has run okay. Now let's do a frequency distribution check on the new variables that we've created. So we can see that the 3 variables have been created and the frequency distribution is similar to what we had seen earlier when we did the procfrec for exclude underscore ind. So the code has run okay, and we have 3 new variables now in the dataset. In this video we are going to cover how to identify outliers and how to treat them. Outlier values are basically extreme values. These values can be values that are much higher than the average population or much lower than the average population. In either of the cases, these values are extreme enough to skew the data. Hence, it's a good idea to identify and treat the outlier values before we start the modeling process. If we don't do this step, then the outlier values may end up skewing the model. So let's start with identifying the variables that have outlier values. Univariate and frequency distributions are a good method of identifying outlier values. We can run a proc univariate in SAS in order to understand the spread of the data and also identify outlier values. So one basic thing that we need to look at when we look at univariate distributions is to understand the spread of the data. Proc univariate in SAS gives us an output that can help us understand the distribution of the variable. So for example, if you look at the table on the left side here, you can see that the population has been divided into quantiles. So we have the maximum value, which is denoted by the 100th percentile, which we have the 99th percentile value, the 95th percentile value, 90th percentile value, 75th percentile value, 50th percentile value, which is the median, 25th percentile value, 10th, 5th, 1st and the lowest value. So we have all of these values that the proc univariate output provides us with. It also provides us with the value of extreme observations. So it's taken the 5 observations with the lowest values and 5 observations with the highest values, and these are denoted in this table under extreme observations. Now in this case, if you look at the spread of the distribution, you will see that essentially the whole the variable has only one value. There is no spread in the distribution. The max value is 1 and the minimum value is 1, which means that all the values are 1. So the first step is to drop variables with no variation in distribution. So you will run proc univariate on each of the variables in the dataset. You will look at the distribution, you will identify variables which have no variation or very little variation in distribution and remove them from your modeling dataset. These are variables because they don't have any variation. They are essentially useless in terms of predictive power. So we can take them out of our model. The next step is to review and understand the spread of data for all the other variables. Identify outlier values and cap outliers if required. So here we look at another output. We are looking at essentially the same output for a different variable, and now you can see that for this variable the median is 10 The 25th percentile value is 0 and all values before that are all 0. The median is 10. The 75th percentile is 52. 90th percentile is 156. 99th percentile value is 1400, and then the max value is 20,511. So we can see that this variable has a very skewed distribution. While the minimum value is 0, the 99th percentile value is 1400, but the 100th percentile value is 20,511. So any value above 1400 is essentially an outlier value in this case, right? And if we look at the 5 most extreme values, we can see that observation number 7785 has a value of 20,511. That's the max value. The second largest value is 17,468, then 10,817, then 9,721, and then 9,600. So essentially we can see that there are a few values above the 99th percentile which have very skewed numbers. So it makes sense to treat these outlier values. So in this case, what can we do? One simple way of capping outliers is to take the 99th percentile value. So in this case, we take that value as 1400, and we say that for this variable, if any observation has a value greater than 1400, any observation that has a value greater than the 99th percentile value, then we will change that value to 1400 or the 99th percentile value. So any value higher than 1400 will be changed to 1400. In this way, we are taking care of all the extreme observations. Here again you can see how the code works. So for the first variable dy90 return amount percentage, the first percentile value is 0, whereas the lowest value is minus 9.9999. So what we are doing is we are capping the values at the first percentile value. So we are saying if there's any value which is lower than the first percentile value, which is 0, then change it to 0. So if dy90 underscore ret underscore amount percentage less than 0, then make it 0. Similarly, if gs4 is less than minus 11060, which is the first percentile value, then change any value that is lower than this to this value. So this is essentially how outlier capping works. You look at the univariate and frequency distributions to identify the outliers. If you're using SAS, you can also plot the distribution using the plot option in proc univariate, and you can then identify all the outlier values and replace these outlier values by the first percentile and the 99th percentile values. So any values lower than the first percentile value will be changed to the first percentile value. Any values higher than the 99th percentile value will be changed to the 99th percentile value. This takes care of outliers. So essentially now we've capped the outliers. Let's now see how this works in SAS. So here we are running a proc univariate on the var dly underscore 80. Okay, it's a simple command, proc univariate data is equal to, and then the variable that you want to run it for. There are multiple options in proc univariate that you can explore. One option is plot, which works in base SAS, which will help you plot the data as well. In this case, we are running it without the plot option. We run this, and now let's look at the results. So this is the univariate procedure. You can see that there are 11,008 observations. The mean for this variable is 85. The standard deviation is 425. We have the values for variance, skewness, and kurtosis. Also, you can see the basic statistical measures here: mean, median, mode, standard deviation, variance, and range, interquartile range. All of these are shown in the proc univariate output. What we are more interested in is the output at the end, the quantiles, the distribution by quantiles, and the extreme observations. So in this case, we can see that 99th percentile value 1400 is any value above So in this distribution, we can see that any value above the 99th percentile value, which is 1400, is an extreme value, and we need to cap it at this value. So we will basically write a simple code which says any value greater than 1400 is going to be capped at 1400. So this is essentially how we do outlier capping. Now we will understand how to partition the data and create the model and the validation data set. Before we start the modeling process, it is important to break the data that we have into modeling and validation data sets. The model is typically built on one set of population and it is validated on another set of population. The model is validated on a population that it has not been built on in order to understand how it performs on new data. In our case, we are already working with a bias sample. If you remember, we have already taken a sample of 4% of all non-fraud accounts and all the fraud accounts in order to create this bias sample. So in this bias sample, we have 11,008 observations. We have 10,000 non-frauds and 1,008 frauds. In this case, we are going to partition the bias sample into two populations, the modeling and the validation data set. The model population will have 70% of the data and roughly 700 frauds in the modeling population. And we'll have the validation population, which will be 30% of the sample, which will have approximately 300 frauds. So we are going to break our bias sample into these two separate data sets. We are going to build the model on the modeling data set, and we are going to validate it on the validation data set. Since we have about 1,000 frauds in the data, we've kept 700 in the modeling population and roughly 300 in the validation population. So we will use the model population with the 700 frauds in it to build the model, and we'll use the validation population with about 300 frauds in it to validate the model. The SAS code for partitioning the dataset is as follows. You're creating two datasets, a.modeling and a.validation, from your bias sample, which is a.sample2. We use the ranuni function in order to randomly partition the data. And what we are saying is, if ranuni less than 0.7, so about 70% of the cases you output the data to a.modeling, and 30% of the cases you will output the data to a.validation. So this is a simple code to partition the dataset. We will now run a SAS code to partition the dataset. We are creating two datasets, a.modeling and a.validation from sample2. We run the code and we check the log, and the log is saying that a.modeling has 7,732 observations and a.validation has 3,276 observations. So we've partitioned our sample data into two separate datasets, one for modeling and one for validation. Variable selection is a crucial process of model building. We need to select the right variables in order to build a powerful model. This is especially important in cases when we are dealing with datasets with a large number of variables. If we have datasets with hundreds or thousands of variables, then it is important to eliminate some of the variables and reduce the number to a more manageable size. So in this case, we've got 31 variables and we need to select the right variables from these 31. So we may end up with 10, 15 or 20 variables that we will use to build the final model. We will use the proc logistic option for variable selection. This is the code that we would run for variable selection. We will use the proc logistic step. The dependent variable here is GT2. We will add the entire var list here, all the variables that we want to use for modeling. And we will use selection is equal to stepwise and max step equal to 1 function. Max step equal to 1 function enables us to run the regression fairly quickly. If you run the model with stepwise selection, and if you have thousands of variables in your dataset, it could take a very long time for the model to run. So in order to optimize your model running, you would first use the max step equal to 1 option, which means that the model has to run only once. So the algorithm will not run multiple iterations for the model, it will just run one iteration, which means that we will get the results quickly. We look at the output of the proc logistic. The output is similar to the standard output that we get from the logistic procedure. Of all the 31 variables, we can see that there are a few variables that are highlighted here which have a high p-value. We will remove variables with a high p-value. In our case, we are removing all variables with a p-value higher than 0.25. If we have a larger number of variables that are coming in significant, we could make this cutoff tighter. So we could make the cutoff equal to 0.05. If we have fewer variables, we could make the cutoff looser, so we could make it 0.5. So we will run the proc logistic option with the selection equal to stepwise and max step equal to 1 option. This enables us to select the right variables. So this is the final variable list. This is the list that we will use to build the model. Having finalized the variables, we now need to start analyzing each of these variables individually in detail. So the first step for that is decile creation. In decile creation, we basically take the population distribution for any variable. That is, we take the entire population and we divide this population into 10 groups of equal sizes. So essentially what we do is we are sorting the variable and then we are dividing it into 10 groups in ascending or descending order. The order doesn't matter, but we are dividing the whole population into 10 equal groups. We use the univariate procedure to perform decile segmentation. This is the code that we use in SAS. In this procedure, we are dealing with the variable daily credit card count. The univariate procedure gives us the option to specify which percentile points we want to show in the output. So in this case, we've mentioned percentile points 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 and 100. So the 10 decile points are what we've mentioned here as percentile points. The percentile pre option allows us to specify how the new variables that are created with these values will be prefixed. So essentially we are creating 10 variables: daily credit card count 10, daily credit card count 20, daily credit card count 30 and so on. We are creating 10 variables and then we will use the values in these variables to divide the entire population for the variable daily credit card count into 10 deciles. So let's see how we do this in SAS. So we will first run the proc univariate. We will run the proc univariate on the modeling dataset. We use the no print option because we want the output to go into a dataset called daily credit card count data that we are creating here, and we don't want the output printed. So we first run this. We check the log to make sure that we've run this correctly. There won't be any output for this code. Now we first retain the 10 new values that we've created in the modeling dataset. Then we compare the daily credit card count value with these 10 points, the 10 decile values that we've created, in order to split the variable into 10 deciles. So we are creating a final variable called daily credit card count group 10, which can take values from 1 to 10 depending on which decile that observation is falling in. So in this way, we've basically partitioned the population for the variable daily credit card count into 10 equal groups. Now let's check the distribution of the dependent variable along these 10 groups. So we run a procfrec procedure here. We check the log and then we check the list. We check the list here. We can see that there are 3 groups that have been formed, actually 8, 9 and 10. About 80% of the population has fallen into decile 8, which means that at the lower end the values are all grouped together. They are all bunched together, so we are unable to separate them into 8 different deciles. Instead they are all clubbed into one. And then we have two other deciles, 9 and 10. Now let's understand why we've done this whole exercise. So the purpose of this exercise is to create one binary variable for the variable daily credit card count. So we first divided the population into 10 different deciles. Here we've actually ended up with 3 deciles. Now we look at the distribution of the dependent variable across these 3 deciles, And when we examine this, we can see that the percentage of frauds in decile 8 is close to 10%. It's 8,887 from roughly 8,800 accounts. So the fraud rate is roughly 10% in this decile. Whereas in deciles 9 and 10, the fraud rate is actually close to 6%. We can see that decile 8 has a higher fraud rate than deciles 9 and 10. So now what we can do is split the population into two groups. One group is the population that forms decile 8 and the other group is the population that forms deciles 9 and 10. So we will create one binary variable which will take a value of 1 if the observation falls in decile 8 and it will take a value of 0 if the observation falls in decile 9 or 10. So this is how we've created one binary variable for the continuous variable daily credit card count. We will repeat this process for all the variables that we've shortlisted. So all the 18 variables that we've shortlisted, we will separate them into deciles. Then we will examine those deciles to see where we will introduce the split, and then we will create a binary variable along that split. This is the code that we will use to create the binary variable. As per the code, we are creating a new variable called daily credit card count underscore low, which will take a value of 1 if the observations fall in decile 8, and it will take a value of 0 if the observations fall in decile 9 or 10. So we run this to create an additional variable. Now let's run the same process for another variable dly underscore 80. So we first run the proc univariate. We check the log, proc univariate has run okay. We then create the deciles and we also look at the distribution of the dependent variable along those deciles. We can see that there are 6 deciles that have been found for dly underscore 80. And now if we examine these deciles, we can see that decile 5 seems to have a much higher fraud rate than the other deciles. So we will introduce the break at decile 5. So we will change the 8 to 5, and now we've created a binary variable for the variable dly underscore 80. So in this way, we are going to create binary variables for all the variables that we've selected. Variable transformation is an important step in data preparation, especially if we are going to use logistic regression as our modeling technique later. Logistic regression is a powerful and robust statistical technique that works well when we are trying to predict the probability of an event occurring. One of the important factors while performing logistic regression is to ensure that the predictor variables, or the variables that we are using to predict the dependent variable, have as linear a relationship with the dependent variable as possible. So the way the logistic regression technique works, the more linear the relationship between the dependent and the independent variables, the better the results. Now oftentimes the variables that we have in our data set may not be strictly linearly related to our dependent variable. However, some of the transformations of these variables may be linearly related to the dependent variable. So the idea in the variable transformation step is to create a lot of different transformations of the same variable and then identify the particular transformation that has the most linear relationship with the dependent variable. There are many different variable transformations that we can create: sine, cosine, square, cube, square root, cube root, log, log inverse, cosine inverse, sine inverse, tangent. All of these are transformations, and here an analyst is only limited by his own imagination. There are so many different transformations that you can incorporate by creating simple formulae in SAS. So in this step we are going to understand how do we create transformations of the same variable and how do we identify the best possible transformation to be included in the model. Now let's understand how we create variable transformations in SAS. We will create transformations for one variable to understand the process, and then the same process has to be repeated for all the variables that have been selected. So here is the code for creating different variable transformations. Basically what we need to do is just create new variables by applying the right mathematical formula. So here we are creating variable transformations for the variable dly_at. The first transformation is that of creating a variable called dly_at_sq. This is basically the square of the original variable. Similarly, we've created the cube of the variable. We call it dly_at_cu. We've created the square root, the cube root, log, exponent, tangent, sine, cosine, and then we can also create the inverse of all these transformations. So first we create the inverse of the original variable. We can then create squared inverse, cubed inverse, square root inverse, cube root inverse, log inverse, exponent inverse, and tangent, sine, and cosine inverse. So here we've created 19 transformations of the same variable, and there's no limit to the number of transformations you can create. So you can create 30-40 different transformations. You are only limited by your imagination here. Whatever transformation makes sense for you given the type of variable, you can create that. So this is the process for creating variable transformations for the same variable. The next step now is to identify the particular transformation that is most linearly related to the dependent variable. So we identify the most relevant of all the 19 transformations that we've created. So we've created 19 different transformations using the code previously. And if you remember, we also have created a binary variable. We split the variable dly_at into 10 deciles, and then we split the population into two groups based on where we saw the most differentiation. We've created a new variable called dly_at_low. So now we have the original variable plus its 19 transformations plus the binary variable that we created using decile segmentation. Now we put all these 21 variables into the model, and we use the selection is equal to stepwise option. We use max step is equal to 3. We will run this code and examine the results in order to identify the best transformation from all of these variables. So just to recap, what we are doing is basically trying to identify the one transformation of a variable that is most linearly related to the dependent variable. So the first step is to create various transformations of the same variable. In our case, we created 19 different transformations of the same variable. We also had the original variable as well as the binary variable that we created using decile segmentation. So we put all of these 21 variables into the model, and we use the selection is equal to stepwise option in order to identify the one transformation that was most linearly related. Here we see the results of the stepwise logistic regression procedure. The option max step is equal to 2 has been used. The two strongest forms of the variable dly_at are the inverse of the square of the variable as well as the square root. If you look at the output of the logistic regression, you will see the last step in that is the model building summary. You click on that and you will see the two variables that have been selected by the model using the max step is equal to 2 option. So the two variables here are dly_at_sqri and dly_at_sqrt, the inverse of the square as well as the square root of the variable. This process is repeated for all the remaining variables. We would similarly create transformations for all the variables, and then we will put those transformations into the model using the max step equal to 2 option. This enables us to select the two winning transformations for each continuous variable. The two winning transformations of each variable are then combined together, and these are the variables that will go into the final model. This is the list of the final variables. You will see that dly underscore at underscore sqri and dly underscore at underscore sqrt were selected as the two winning combinations when we ran the variable selection procedure for the variable dly underscore at. Similarly, we've run it for all the other variables and got the two winning transformations for each variable. So this is the final variable list. Now we get into the model creation part. Now that we have the full list of candidate variables, we are going to run logistic regression with three different selection options. First, we will run the stepwise selection option. Then we will run the backward selection option. We will take the combination of the winning variables from both the methods and put it into a logistic regression using the score selection. So the first step here is to run the stepwise procedure. We will run the stepwise procedure using the option SLE equal to 0.3 and SLS equal to 0.3. SLE equal to 0.3 means that the sensitivity level for entering into the model is 0.3, and SLS equal to 0.3, which stands for the sensitivity level for staying. So these are basically the sensitivity levels for variables entering and remaining in the model. We run the stepwise procedure. This is the first page of the output. We can see that we've run the stepwise selection procedure here. We look at the analysis of maximum likelihood estimates. This is the part of the results that tells us what the model looks like. So we can see all the variables that are there in the model. So the model has selected all of these variables that have a significance level of less than equal to 0.3. So that's essentially what we've done. We've asked the algorithm to create a model in which we can have all the variables which have a sensitivity level of less than equal to 0.3. We can also see percent discordant and percent concordant as per the model. This gives us an indication of how good the model is. The next step is now to run the backward selection procedure. So again, you can see the code is fairly similar, except that we are using the selection equal to backward option, and we use an SLS equal to 0.3, which means that again we are using a significance level of 0.3. Here we can again see the first step in the output of the backward procedure. This is the final model. All the variables which have a significance level of less than equal to 0.3 are there in this model. We can also see the percent concordant and discordant again to get a sense of how good the model is. Now what we are going to do is take a union of the variables that have come in significant in both the procedures. So all the variables that have come in significant using the stepwise option, as well as all the variables that have come in significant using the backward option, will be combined to form one list. And now we will use the score option to select the best two models from all the models possible using these variables. Again, you can see the code for using the selection equal to score option. We use the best equal to 2 option to select the best two models. So what this procedure does is it gives us the two best models for different number of variables in the model. If there was only one variable that we wanted to stay in the model, what are the best two models that we can get scored on the basis of the chi-square. So this option enables us to select the best model using the chi-square test. There are a number of factors to consider when selecting the model from the list of score. If you want a simple model, then you will probably look at a model with 10 or fewer variables. Or if you want a more accurate model, you could look at a model with a higher number of variables. But in general, you would use the chi-square score to see how good the model is and then make a trade-off between the number of variables and the accuracy of the model. So here we can see that if we have only one variable in the model, then that variable would be mont12 underscore auth underscore amount underscore cube inverse CUI, and that has a chi-square score of 3544. If we add another variable, the score goes up to 4050, it goes up to 4346 if we add a third variable, and so on. We can look at the models with 6 variables, 7 variables going up to 11 variables here, and we can see that the chi-square is increasing from 4501 in the case of 6 variables to 4562 in the case of 11 variables. The score is rising further as we increase the number of the variables, and we can see that the model with 21 variables has a chi-square score of 4584. But we can also see that a model with 19 variables also doesn't have chi-square that is much lower than the one from the 21 variable model. In fact, if we look at the model which has the number of variables equal to 14, we can see it has a pretty high chi-square, and after this adding additional variables is not leading to a significant increase in the chi-square score. So having 14 variables in the final model is probably a good bet here. There are two options that we've been presented with. We can either look at the variables and then decide which model we like based on the variables that go into it, or we can simply choose the model with the higher chi-square, which is the first one in this case. So now that we've chosen the final model and the variables that go into the final model, now we need to score the data. So for this we use the output out equal to option along with the pred option. So what we are doing is we are creating a new data set called out_act1, and we are creating a variable called pred which will store the value of the prediction of the model. Now the output dataset contains the predicted probability for every observation. So we've run the scoring output procedure. The next step now is to create gains chart. So we first sort the new dataset that we've created by descending probability. So that means that the observations with the highest predicted probability are at the top and the observations with the lowest predicted probability are at the bottom. We then create deciles or 10 groups using the proc rank procedure, and then we use the frec procedure to understand the distribution of the variable gt2, our dependent variable, by the deciles that we've created just now. Let us understand what we've done so far. We first scored the entire modeling data set. That is, we assigned a predicted probability for each observation in the modeling dataset. We basically asked the model to calculate what is the probability of each observation being a fraudulent transaction. We now have a probability value assigned to each observation. This probability refers to the probability or the chance of that observation being a fraudulent transaction. This has been calculated on the basis of the equation that the algorithm has created for the model. Now we sort the data based on this predicted probability. Then we divide it into 10 equal groups, and then we calculate the actual percentage of frauds in each of the group. This is the data that you are seeing here. We have 10 groups or 10 deciles, and we have the actual number of frauds as well as the non-frauds in each of these groups. Now if our model works the way we expect it to, the percentage of the frauds in the group that has the records with the highest assigned probability should be the highest. We will also expect the percentage frauds to go down as we move from the top decile to the lower deciles. So if you look at this table, it shows us the actual frauds in each of the deciles. If you notice, the first decile seems to have a high fraud rate. The number of frauds in general is going down as we move from the top decile to the bottom decile. You can see that the top decile has 674 frauds, whereas the bottom decile has only 23 frauds. So let's create some additional columns. We'll first look at the total records in each decile. We will then also look at the fraud rate in each decile. Okay, so now let's calculate the percentage fraud in each decile. We will also calculate the total number of records in each decile. So let's do that first. Number of records. Okay, so we'll just sum up the total number of frauds plus non-frauds. Okay, we will just change the formatting of the cells here so it's shown as numbers. So we have 1100 records in each decile, roughly 10% of the population. Now let's calculate the fraud rate in each decile, which is simply the number of frauds divided by the total number of records. So the first thing that you will notice here is that the fraud rate is highest in decile 0, it's 61% here. It reduces to 7% in decile 1, 5% in decile 2, 4% in decile 3, and finally less than 2% in decile 9. The overall fraud rate for the population is 9%. Now let's create 4 additional columns. In the first column we will calculate the percentage of records in each decile. Since each decile has roughly 10% of the population, the value for this column is going to be 10% for all the deciles. The next column is where we will create a cumulative value. So we will say what is the percentage of records in decile 0, then we will say what is the percentage of records in decile 0 plus 1, then decile 0 plus 1 plus 2, and so on. So the values here we will see will go from 10% to 20% to 30% up to 100%. So here we are just calculating the percentage of records in each decile. Okay, and we will just round it off. It's roughly 10% for each decile. Now we will just add another column which shows the cumulative percentage of records. So here we are just creating a cumulative column. And now what we are going to do, and this is just for the sake of graphing, we are going to move this whole thing down and we are going to add another value 0%. This is just because in the graph, when you see, you will understand, we want to show the line going from 0% to 100%. Similarly, we will calculate the percentage of frauds and the cumulative percentage frauds. Okay, so the percentage of frauds is this. Okay, and similarly we will create the cumulative percentage frauds. This will also go up to 100%. We'll do the same thing with this column. We'll move all the values down and we will add a value for 0%. Now what we are going to do is simply take these two columns and we are going to graph this. Okay, so this is the formatted graph. You can clearly see how the model is better than a random prediction. If we were making a random prediction, the line would roughly follow the blue line that you see here in the graph. That is 10% of the observations would contain 10% of the frauds. But because our model allows us to make a prediction about which transactions are likely to be fraudulent, we are able to improve the results from what they would have been under random circumstances. So 10% of the population that our model identifies as likely to be fraud has 67% of the total frauds. So that's a significant improvement. So we've identified 10% of the population that has 67% of the overall frauds. So if we can somehow just create a strategy that identifies this 10% population and we can put some additional checks on this population, we may be able to control the fraud rate significantly. So this is how the gains chart works. This is how a gains chart looks like. It tells us for each decile or each 10% of the population, what's the maximum fraud that we can capture. So as per the model, the maximum fraud that we can capture is 67% in decile 0. So this is essentially the graph that you will use to find out how good the model is. This is also the graph that you will use to present the results of your model. This is the graph that you will use to show the management how good or how effective your model is. So this is the graph that we've created for the modeling dataset. Now, in order to do the validation of the model, we will perform the same exercise on the validation dataset. That is, we will first score the validation dataset using the model that we've selected. We will then sort the validation dataset based on descending probability that has come out or that has been assigned by the model. We will then divide the validation dataset into 10 equal groups or 10 deciles, and we will calculate the fraud rate in each of those deciles. We will create a gains chart similar to the one that we've created here for the modeling dataset. If that gain chart, that is the gain chart on the validation dataset, seems to be doing as well as the graph on the modeling dataset, then we will say that the model results are robust and we can accept this model. If, however, we see a significant degradation of results in the validation dataset as compared to the modeling dataset, then we are going to infer that there is something wrong with our model. It's not as robust as we think it is. A common cause for this could be overfitting, which means that the model does really well on the modeling dataset but may not do well on any other dataset like the validation dataset. So that's something that we need to keep in mind, and this is why we perform this exercise on both the modeling as well as the validation dataset. We compare the results and ensure that our model is almost as robust on the validation dataset as it is on the modeling dataset. We have created the gains chart for the modeling dataset. The next step now is model validation. This is where we will validate the results of our model using a different dataset called the validation dataset. This is the code to score the validation dataset. We use the proc logistic option. We create a new dataset called a.valscore. This dataset has a single observation, which is basically the coefficients of all the variables that go into the final model. So if you look at the proc print of this dataset, there is only one observation, and that contains the coefficients of all the variables that will go into the final model. The final scoring is done using proc score. This procedure multiplies the coefficients in the model with the values in the dataset to be scored and creates a new dataset which contains the est observation or the estimate value. So here we are scoring the dataset a.validation. We are creating a new dataset called a.valscore2, and we are taking the coefficients from the dataset a.valscore. Once we've scored the validation dataset, the next step is to create the gains chart similar to what we had seen earlier for the modeling dataset. You can see the validation gains chart, and here we can see a comparison of the gains chart on the modeling dataset versus the gains chart on the validation dataset. In the modeling dataset, the first decile or the top 10% were capturing 67% of the frauds. In the validation dataset, the number is lower, it's closer to 59%. We can see that the model has performed better on the modeling dataset than on the validation dataset. The results for the validation dataset are fairly close to the modeling dataset. They are not as good as the modeling dataset, but they are close to it, and hence we can say that this model is fairly robust. So this is the first step that we do in order to validate the results of our model. We will build the model on the dataset called the modeling dataset, and then we will validate the model using another dataset, a separate dataset called the validation dataset. We create gains chart for both the modeling data as well as the validation data, and then we do a comparison of the two gains chart to see how well the model has performed on the validation dataset as compared to the modeling dataset. The next step now is to use sampling techniques to perform further validation on our model. Now we've defined the problem and we've explored the data. We've converted all character variables into numeric variables. The next step now is data preparation. So the first step in data preparation is missing values, identifying missing values and treating them. In our case, we'll run a proc means to identify missing values. We will run a proc means with the option nmiss, which will tell us the number of values for each variable that are missing. So let's run the proc means here. And if we look at the results, the proc means procedure tells us the number of missing values for each variable. In this case, if you look at the data set, we don't have any variables with missing values. This is a good thing for us because we don't need to do any missing value treatment now.